for instance, the first time I saw John Woo's The Killer, I was watching it with a piece of foolscap with transcribed subtitles. And sort of trying to keep up with, sort of guess, okay, I think they're probably saying this bit here that's written down in order to follow the plot.
I said it before and I'll say it again. Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Never fear change. Life is too short for fear. Chase what is desired.
I can do this all day.
Would you mind identifying what you are?
We're the best friends squad. That's what we call ourselves. Sort of like a team.
Welcome to the rodeo. Ladies and gentlemen, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride.
This is the way.
I have spoken.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fantasy Show's Totally Pretentious, a podcast about great movies. I'm Sean.
And I'm David.
And on today's show, we're going to be talking about 1985's Police Story, starring and directed by none other than the great Kung Fu master, Jackie Chan. So before we get into talking about that, we just need to make kind of a statement regarding Jackie Chan more broadly, but then just kind of a policy going forward about how we're going to deal with things. This is the second time we have had a film by or starring a person who has a problematic history. The previous one being when we talked about Klaus Kinski. This time, Jackie Chan has, we've sort of discovered recently over the last few decades, made some pretty I would say controversial statements regarding Hong Kong and civil rights and those kinds of things. These are things you can look up online. We'll put some links in the description. We're not going to assess those in any way except to say that we were personally very uncomfortable with them because of the kinds of things that he was saying and the criticism he has received. And it made David and I have a moment where we needed to talk about how we're going to deal with films by essentially controversial figures or featuring controversial figures in the future. To the best of our ability, we're going to probably take a bit more of a proactive approach in how we select the films. We're going to do our best to avoid figures who we think are potentially doing harm, at least when those people are still alive and capable of doing that harm. That's really what this comes down to. We're going to try to do a better job of being aware of these things before we select a film. Obviously, we can't predict when that's going to happen because people being people, people do controversial things from time to time. So we'll try to avoid it as best as possible. In this case, we just weren't terribly proactive because I was excited to do a Jackie Chan film because his films are fun. And then David pointed me out some things that he had said about Hong Kong that I think both of us were very uncomfortable with and thought were not good. And so that's where we're at this moment.
And just to further to that, I didn't come across that article until well after Sean had picked the film. So we're going to reserve the right, therefore, that if we find out something after we've already announced the film, to change the film for the forthcoming episode.
Yeah, kind of have to, I guess. This is the world we're living in now. Oh boy, goodness gracious. So, with that in mind, I guess we gotta get to this film that we're going to be talking about, yeah?
That's right.
So we're going to be talking about Police Story. It is, I think, probably one of Jackie Chan's most familiar films. It's the film that largely helped build his stardom, at least in the West to a certain degree. He became a little bit more famous with some later films. But this is one of his big ones, and it is Jackie Chan's personal favorite, he has said on multiple occasions. So he really loves Police Story. Yeah, he just loves this film. Yeah. So I'm sure he's done films where he was like, production-wise, this was better, but he has said that this is one of his personal favorite films he's ever done. I will note it was one of the first films that he had full control over.
Right.
So that may have some factor there. Project A, which preceded this, is another one. I think was what Project A is when he started the stunt crew, the Jackie Chan stunt team. So, and they obviously are active in this film. So, but I guess we should offer a synopsis.
Well, your film, Sean. I'll leave the field to you.
Oh, you're a monster. Police Story is set in Hong Kong, involving the Royal Hong Kong Police Force, in which our main character, Inspector Kevin Chan, played by Jackie Chan, is involved in a sting operation to basically collect a crime lord by the name of Chu Tao, who attempts to basically, I guess you could say, move money around, sell drugs, do all kinds of weird crime lordy stuff. The opening scene of this is probably the most famous scene next to the pole sliding scene, pole escape. I don't know what you call that scene. It involves a shantytown being destroyed as the police close in on Chutao, and eventually, basically, this shantytown gets destroyed. And in the process, our hero, Kevin Chan, is eventually sort of coaxed into becoming the quote unquote bodyguard of the mistress of Chutao with the intention of eliciting her support in order to testify against him and eventually have him arrested and put in prison. Things being as they are in Jackie Chan films, everything goes sideways. There are assassination attempts on the individual he has set to protect. He has to deal with the comedic problems that involve his girlfriend who thinks he may be cheating on him. There's also elements of politics. There's a hilarious scene involving phones, which is like straight out of like a Buster Keaton. There's all of this stuff going on, and it comes to a head towards the end when our hero Kevin Chan sort of like hits the edge of his rope and goes a bit vigilante, I suppose you could say, and it eventually does get Chutao to be finally arrested proper and eventually charged with the crimes. That's ultimately the basic story that we're given here. There's knife-wielding assassins, there's cool car chases, there's a fight in a bus involving umbrellas, all of this fun stuff, and also betrayal. There are cops that are betraying people, all that stuff going on. It's a fun film, very action-heavy, very comedy-centric. It is the quintessential Jackie Chan film.
So yeah, I know I'm gonna actually have to put an asterisk on the description of it as being action heavy, particularly compared to some of the stuff that would come later. But you know what? We can talk about that afterwards.
That's interesting, David.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let's yeah. Got a bit of a history for this film with this film, and but I'll tell you about that in due course.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well, I guess the big thing we should probably start with is I think we have to talk about the stunts of this film because
Yeah.
we could talk about the story, and I think part of why I want to start by talking about like the action set pieces that are here, and we'll put asterisks on action because David has apparently a hang up on the word action. I'm being a little facetious.
Oh no, just no. Yeah, action heavy is the action scenes that are here are, especially the opening and the concluding ones, are justifiably renowned.
Sure. And they're all, again, stunt heavy, right? This is the Jackie Chan stunt team era. This is full of people getting thrown through windows and jumping off the top of buildings. The opening sequences, they basically destroy a shanty town by having multiple cars driving down this shantytown built on the side of a road, having multiple camera angles, these cars going through buildings and all of this stuff as part of this big chase. It's a big set piece. And, today they would not do it the same way, right? This is multiple camera angles, done in seemingly real time, one shot, as far as I can tell, one shot, and just cutting between the different cameras and showing different angles of the same shot. These days, they'd do it in smaller components and do pieces of it in order to give the impression of that scale. In this case, the scale's pretty visible. You see the wide angle shot.
Yeah, just having that long shot of the of the cars going down that slope like it's some sort of avalanche is really very striking.
It is. It's really a fun scene to watch, and it is part of the interesting fact about how this film was written. Because unlike maybe how you would traditionally write a film, where you would have characters and story, and then you'd write the story and have some sort of natural progression that followed kind of the expectations of how a plot would proceed. Jackie Chan basically told his co-writer Edward Tang to essentially just, here's a bunch of scenes and props, and I want you to basically build the story around these locations and props. And that's precisely what we get. And you can feel that to a degree, I think, in the film, that there are moments.
Yes. Oh, definitely.
Yeah, there are moments where it's sort of like, okay, well, this is just here just so Jackie Chan could do a cool stunt, or there could be a nifty fight scene here. Maybe the most obvious example of this is the infamous Glass Story scene in China. This film gets the nickname of Glass Story partly because the big fight scene in the mall, a huge component of it, just involves people being thrown into sugar glass. I should note, unusually thick sugar glass. They were using twice thickness sugar glass in order to make the glass seem more real, which of course increases the amount of potential injuries you can get. But yeah, there's just people getting
Hmm.
thrown into glass and glass things, and at one point, Jackie Chan's stunt double is like drives a guy through a big long case of glass. There's a lot of these where it's clear that he just wanted to have a scene that was full of glass getting broken by people being thrown or driven through it. And so that's why that sequence basically exists. It's an alarming amount of glass for any mall shop. I don't know any mall shop I've ever been to that is of that size, that is that glass rich. So, but yeah, so like I think one of the great things about this film is just the stunt work, right? That clearly Jackie Chan was
Yeah.
thinking about this, about the action sequences, the fight scenes. There's some kung fu here, a lot of the action comedy that we get present here. There are just a lot of really fun little bits where it's clear Jackie Chan was having like a real fun time considering how this scene would be put together from an action and stunt perspective. And that's probably what becomes most memorable about this film. And it's a thing that a lot of people, I think, would say is memorable about most Jackie Chan films, is he does extraordinary stunt work. So in this one, the most
Hmm.
famous being the lighted pole sequence when he slides down a big pole covered in lights, and apparently the lighting heated that pole so hot that he actually got second degree burns on his hands. He falls through the roofs of various like little kiosks and all kinds of stuff. There's a lot of these elements there, in addition to the kinds of things you'd expect in a kung fu film, right? There is fighting and punching and kicking, but it's a lot of that famous Jackie Chan sort of comedic, very acrobatic stuff coming from his history in the Peking opera. So there's just a lot of these elements that make this a lot of fun, and I would say that's how I would describe this. This film is a lot of fun to watch.
Which I mean, well, so here's my experience of it. I mean, I think from what you were saying about the comedic aspects of the fight scenes, we can certainly see in here. I think some of these things that would be developed at a much greater length in films to come, with sort of longer, more drawn out fight scenes, and doing like we get in the climax, sort of using the setting almost as a character to shape the fight scenes. And but some of the more almost dance number like or comedic fight scenes would, I think, become much more elaborate in later films. And I want to backtrack here to when I first encountered Jackie Chan. This would have been in the early 90s when Hong Kong cinema was becoming known in on these shores, but for a lot of us, the way we were coming to it was basically through like bootleg videos, or I remember friends and I were going to Chinese video rental stores and getting laser discs and hoping that we'd be lucky that there might be English subtitles on them, and sometimes well, often we weren't lucky, and just trying to get the gist. I remember, for instance, the first time I saw John Woo's The Killer, I was watching it with a piece of foolscap with transcribed subtitles, and sort of trying to keep up with, sort of guess, okay, I think they're probably saying this bit here that's written down in order to follow the plot. And the way I first saw Jackie Chan was in a compilation tape that someone had put together that was nothing but fight scenes from a whole bunch of different movies. And that was amazing. Just this non-stop spectacle of that comedic athletic prowess. And I saw Police Story for the first time around then. I think it might have been after Rumble in the Bronx, which it got its fairly wide theatrical release here, and that was for many of us the first time we actually saw a Jackie Chan film on the big screen in North America. And I remember with some friends and I were watching Police Story, and really the only thing I could remember years afterwards was the shantytown scene, and we found it a slog getting through. And I have to say, I found that this time too, that between the opening scene and the closing scene, I was clock watching. It was really hard to get through, particularly the comedy, which I found absolutely dire. And I was thinking back to how I first like those that compilation tape of just the fight scenes, and it occurred to me that in some ways, for certainly some of his films, that was almost the best way of experiencing the work, because that was the great fight scenes. They were deprived of context, but I don't think they really needed a context. The plot, as you said, was for Police Story was written around getting us to these set pieces, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. The tonal shifts are really bizarre at times as we go from comedy to sudden ranting about police corruption or bureaucratic inadequacies. The explosive anger that we basically freeze frame on at the end of the film is out of keeping with the stepping in dog poop and moonwalking moment. So it's almost the film is a bunch of parts that I'm not sure that they add up to a whole. And the fight scenes now, Chan has certainly been very open about the inspiration of musicals, especially the work of Gene Kelly and others on his work, and it's kind of like the song numbers, right? I mean, you can watch, let's say, Singing in the Rain, you can just watch the song, and you don't need the rest of the movie to enjoy the song. Though I hasten to add that if you look at that Singing in the Rain as a whole does work. That if you look at the Broadway Melody, massive production number, the most elaborate song in the entire film, that really has absolutely nothing to do with the plot, but the fact that it has nothing to do with the plot is commented upon by the characters. And right down to one character having been told, okay, this is what we're going to do. We get the huge number, and then he ends up saying, well, I can't quite visualize it, even though it's just been the most spectacular visualization of the entire film. It's enjoyable without context, but it's even better in its context. And I found that for a number of Jackie Chan's films, but Police Story in particular, the fight scenes work better without the context. That at least to me felt like a slog in order to get to that big scene, because really between the opening and the closing, the other action scenes, we get a couple of them. They're very brief, and at least as far as the fight scenes are concerned. And that telephone scene, it's though it is a very impressive bit of physical comedy, the oral quote unquote comedy, if you will, is really hard to deal with, because as he's getting all these phone calls, and there's phone calls about rape and spousal abuse, which are being delivered as punchlines.
Because they're alongside other things, like a guy's cow went missing and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I realize I've kind of gone on and on a bit here for a number of things, but when you would pick this film, I couldn't remember if it was one that I had seen. And when I hit play and we got to the shanty town, my heart sank. I'm going, oh no, is it this one? And maybe my younger self was wrong to have been bored by this film, but it turns out my past self was correct, at least as far as my present self was concerned.
Well, look, David, I love you, but your past and present self are 73% wrong.
Okay, that's precise.
Yeah, well, I would say that I agree with you. So the scene we're talking about with the telephone, I mean, I agree. There are two things I agree with you here. One really specific and one but your general statement. Probably the weakest part of this film is what you're identifying here, which is this idea that because of the way it's constructed, intentionally, right?
Yes.
Here are these set pieces and here are these props. Now I want you to write the movie around those things. This is like a backwards way of what we would do. What you would do is you would say, what's the story? Who are the characters, right? What is our climax supposed to be? Like, what is the thing that's happening and what's the intended resolution? And this film is done backwards, where it's like, no, like, I want these big set pieces, and then I want you to figure out how we get to them from piece to piece. And I think that
I don't have a problem with that. I don't actually have a problem with that.
I think it works better in other films that he's done.
Yes, because and there are certainly there are a lot of horror movies that I among others that have feel like they've got a similar kind of approach, and I don't have an issue with that. I remember Kim Newman says of Dario Argento's Inferno that it is a film that is nothing but set pieces and therefore all of a piece. And I think that that can work really, really well, and especially if that's what I think that's the correct approach for this film in terms of what it is offering its audience. But I guess my issue is that I needed more set pieces, and or the tissue getting us from one set piece to another felt like very painful filler.
I think part of that is in other Jackie Chan. So for Western audiences, if for the most part, our exposure to Jackie Chan is probably through something like Rush Hour. And by Western, I mean like people in my age bracket. Because you would have been exposed, through like bootleg tapes and maybe like the offhand, some of his earlier films that were translated.
Yeah, I mean the ones that I saw before, long before Rush Hour, were this, Rumble in the Bronx, Super Cop, Legend of
Right.
Drunken Master.
These are the films that helped popularize him in the U.S. Police Story is one of them. I would argue that some of the others probably had Rumble in the Bronx especially, had probably a greater impact, at least in the United States. And so
Mhm.
those would have been the films that, if we were exposed to him in the West, those would have been the films you would have seen. But for
Yeah,
most of us, it's films like Rush Hour. It's when he actually transfers over from not just translated films, but straight into, no, he's speaking English now in
yeah,
American or Western designed films. And Rush Hour, I think, does an interesting thing, which is that it's very clearly written the opposite from how Police Story is written. They had a story, and then they were like, oh, but we got Jackie Chan, and we also got Chris Tucker, who isn't a martial artist. How do we, like, play on the physical comedy in the action pieces, but, like, our story leads to those moments, rather
hmm
than the moments eventually get to a story that's just a, filler. And I think filler is a good way to think about it. A lot of the story components in Police Story are very much filler. They're just like the things we need, because you can't just have an hour and a half action piece. At least not in a traditionally how we'd expect a narrative, because at some point, right, how do you keep one upping yourself? You need to build to something. But they didn't spend enough time, I think, considering how the story was going to gel. And it's not that the story here is bad, it's how it is constructed that is a problem. Because the story is fine, right? It's a crime lord, it's a police dealing with like the bureaucratic functions of society and the way
hmm
that people with wealth and power can manipulate the system. That's all present here, but it's sort of cut up between, also our main character has this unusual tense relationship with his girlfriend and also this witness, and there's like a plot to like convince her to join the police because of an assassination attempt, and yet that's also happening at the same time as the bad guys are actually considering having her assassinated. And then you got all these other, there's like all these little bits and pieces, but they're not necessarily adding to a cohesive whole. They're sort of, it's almost like there's kind of two movies. There is the Jackie
yeah,
Chan doing lots of cool action set pieces, and then there is the all the little bits in between. And while I enjoy the film, I think a lot more than you, I would admit that this is not my favorite Jackie Chan film. I think for me, Drunken Master's probably my favorite Jackie Chan film. He does, in my opinion, a lot more clever physical comedy and kung fu action work there, and I think the story is more cohesive than it is here. It feels more important, I should say, to the
yeah.
character's development in Drunken Master than it does here. And I agree also that even though we get these really great pieces, it does not lead us to the conclusion that we're given, which is
Right.
Kevin basically kind of going mad. He like kidnaps his superior and takes him hostage, and that's kind of alarming, and then manages to escape, but his superior knows that he's not intending to really hurt him, but like he still kidnapped his superior, and then at the very end he like literally flips his lid and just starts beating up people in full view of other people, almost full on vigilante style, right? With the only exception here is he doesn't murder them straight up. And then we end on that anger, and while I like the idea of it, because I think he gives this interesting statement when he is first kidnapping his superior. He's sort of talking about how all these people are doing all of these horrible things, and you keep sending us out to do these difficult jobs and then yelling at us when they don't go well, but like you don't seem to care about us. The bureaucracy of the police doesn't seem to care about like the beat cop, the guy, he's not a beat cop, but the guy who's on the ground doing all of the hard work, and he's like kind of losing it and being like, I'm doing everything right and you guys are trying to blame me for this thing that's not my fault. And that's not right. And then he snaps. He kind of basically snaps. I think that's a cool idea. It's just not developed because I don't think the film's interested in developing it. It's just there. It feels like the story is the set piece, and the action sequences are the actual story.
Yeah, and that moment comes almost out of nowhere. That rant there.
Mm-hmm.
But and I think to pick up on a couple of things you said. Now it's been a long time since I've seen Drunken Master, but
it's so good.
I was thinking about that one in comparison to the conclusion of this one, where, for example, the final battle in that is against a truly awesome opponent, right?
Yes, very menacing.
That scene where he's casually taking his glasses off while standing on one leg with the other leg virtually vertical, right? You know, okay, this guy's going to be really hard to beat.
And they set it up earlier because he does in fact beat a number of people that are important to Jackie Chan's character in that, including Jackie Chan.
Yeah. Whereas the final blows in Police Story are Jackie Chan beating up on a middle-aged guy, right? Our crime lord. And it's like, I mean, I get the explosion of rage, but I was also thinking about that moment at the end of Fable 2, where I accidentally killed the final boss because my fingers slipped and hit the left trigger, and I killed him mid-speech. The final, the sort of the big boss here isn't really, I mean, he wasn't being set up as a fighter, but it was an odd moment. And the other thing is, now, granted, they're different films. They're not comedic, but if you look at the things that John Woo was doing at around the same time, so I think Better Tomorrow comes out, I think, is the same year as Police Story, or the year after. And so if you look at sort of like the late 80s stuff of the two Better Tomorrow films, The Killer, Bullet in the Head, and Hard Boiled, where there too you have these films that have very, very, Hard Boiled in particular, let's say, clearly constructed around the colossal set pieces, with guns instead of or with a sprinkling of martial arts, right? But it's these gigantic over the top action scenes that are the key points of the film. This is what you've come to see. Right. But the connective tissue that gets us from one thing to the other serves to make us care about the characters.
Right.
And to feel the stakes of what is going on, which most of the filler in Police Story made me not care. I wanted to fast forward to get to the good bits. I'm just not interested in his difficulties with his girlfriend, and let's not even get into the way the women characters are written in this film, insofar as they are characters at all, and most of the scenes they're given just involve flailing and squawking, and I say that in the sense that is how they're being portrayed,
as opposed to what we would get later with something like Michelle Yeoh, where she is
in Super Cop.
Yeah, in Super Cop. Yeah.
Yeah, very different there. So it's like, oh, okay, let me get through this, and then I know there will be a good bit. I sort of found myself cycling back to wondering if the best way of seeing this stuff was like that compilation tape where I'm seeing these magnificent acrobatic scenes stripped of all the filler that drags the films down, and it doesn't matter to me who the whys of the fights. It's just that, okay, Jackie Chan's our hero and he has to defeat these bad guys. The specifics of that don't really matter, in the same way that they don't really matter here, right? In the sense that there isn't really any weight to what's going on. Like you said, there's an interesting idea that's raised, but it's just that's it. It's raised. It's not something that the film has any particular interest in. Just we have to do that in order to finally get to our big blowout in the shopping mall.
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing where it's like the ideas are presented, but the film doesn't want to follow through on them because it's not interested in actually exploring where those elements go. I mean, I think like the
Hmm.
girlfriend is a good example. I mean, this is it. The story that's happening here is not like an unusual story, right? Guy brings another woman home, and his girlfriend, jealous, thinks that he had. Well, to be clear, he brings her home in her lingerie, so her
Yes.
bed dressings, her pajamas, as it were. And so naturally, her first reaction is, "Oh, you were cheating on me." It also happens to be his birthday, so she throws a cake in his face, hence physical comedy. And while that's an interesting idea of like, there is a moment when he's basically been tricked into admitting that he really does love his girlfriend, but instead of just having it be like a guy having to realize that he needs to like be honest with the woman he loves and like be more open and receptive to her, it just sort of glosses past that and tries on one hand to make us think that the girlfriend is the one that's irrational here, but also
Hmm.
just like kind of wipes it away later when she's helping him and there isn't really much of a conversation that occurs. There is one, but it's like an inconsequential conversation. There isn't a development that needs to happen. He doesn't need to
No.
change in any significant way. In fact, the only change we see in him is one that seems to come out of left field, of him kind of losing it and going vigilante. And so
Yeah.
it's this issue that like, because the film wants to treat these plot elements as set pieces rather than things that actually lead to something, stuff just gets resolved only so that we can proceed to the next piece of filler or the next action set piece or whatever it is. It's just there long enough to set up that there is tension with quotation marks, only so that we can like quickly resolve it or just to ignore it altogether. And that's what the film does quite a lot. It sets it up, it puts it there, it kind of maybe plays with it for a minute, and then just kind of later on is like, whatever. Like, here's the thing that I think people need to consider. There are 4 films in this franchise. How exactly
Hmm.
is he still a police officer after the first one?
Well, let's remember that Herbert Lom keeps coming back as Chief Inspector Dreyfus in the Pink Panther movies, and this includes coming back after having disintegrated both the United Nations building and himself in the Pink Panther Strikes Again. Yet somehow he's back in the following film. So,
Well, yeah, I get what you're saying.
I
Like, this
won't
is a
worry
thing that
you.
does happen in films, that they're, silly or absurd things, and it just kind of like ignores it. But I think if the franchise wants to be this thing where it's like we're doing these films where we want really cool action set pieces and we want like little bits and pieces of like their lives, the thing you can't have is the very first film have your main character go full on vigilante, and then just in the next time you just like, we'll just pretend that didn't happen. He didn't kidnap his own superior. It seems to me that it goes a step too far, and then instead of dealing with the ramifications of that, like something like Dirty Harry might, it instead just, like you said, it freeze frames at the end, right? He beats up this middle-aged man, punches him, pretty much ruins all his kidneys and his liver, and then it freeze frames and just ends, and then we get like the bloopers and the things that go on in the background, as is characteristic of many Jackie Chan films. And I guess, to me, if we're just going to treat the story elements as set piece and really they're just there to help us get to those things, then either those story elements need to be like drawn up to even more absurd lengths so they're silly and fun, and then everything in between, that's all they serve, is they're just to help us like have a little fun as a breather from the action pieces that then we eventually get to. But this, I think, at times wants to have a serious plot line going on, and I don't know that that works.
Yeah, I mean, it only shows up sporadically. Now, I think just wanted to pick up on something else you said, which I hadn't really considered, was the with regards to the comedy. You described some of those scenes, and it occurs to me now that it is exactly what you said, right? It's the breather in between the action scenes, or I mean, some of the action scenes being full on, comedic, such as the quote unquote knife wielding assassin, who's really just one of Jackie Chan's friends arriving to make Bridget Lynn take the threat seriously. So we have a lot, like the comedic scenes. They go on for quite a long time, and I think it'd be fair to consider them not really as filler, but as set pieces of their own. So we alternate between the action set pieces, some of which are comedic, and the just straight up comedy set pieces. So the surprise birthday party with the cakes in the face, the oh no, the risque recording that gets played in court.
That was funny.
The
I'm just gonna say because we've seen the scene, so we know he's talking about a cactus, and so all the lines are innuendo, and it's hilarious.
So and here too, I guess a lot of it comes down to with as in so much humor, the personal taste, right? I found that almost all the humor here for me felt like it would have been rejected by Three's Company as being too corny, and so the recording. I was like, okay, yeah. I got the double entendres when they were first doing the recording, and then I'm going, okay, now we're going to hear it all again in court. And again, I was wishing I could fast forward because I was sitting there stone faced. But you enjoyed it, so
I did. Although I will admit that the scene to me, I think what was supposed to happen is she's trying to trick him to record something that makes him look bad to ruin his case.
yeah.
And I guess that's what happens. But I guess to me, the funnier part of this would have been, let's have the main character be more like a Clouseau figure who kind of or maybe like a Magoo, right? A little bit bumbling, but eventually does sort the issue out. And so it would be a lot funnier if he accidentally recorded this and she wasn't trying to like set him up. And then he realizes in the thing that that's what has happened, is he's accidentally recorded this thing that makes him look really bad. And then that becomes part of the tension with his girlfriend, because he's now having to explain like why it sounds like he's talking about his penis to a woman he supposedly isn't having an affair with. Like, those things, I think it could just be better woven in to make it playful. I mean, I admit some of the comedy here doesn't work, but some of it for me I found really fun. Yes, that joke is old, like people have done versions of that joke, but I love the phone sequence, with the exception of what you'd mentioned earlier, that some of the lines in it, they just do not age well here, right? The jokes about like rape victims and stuff, that's not funny, but the physical comedy of him alone in this police station, rolling around on a rolly chair, answering all these phones and trying to keep straight who he's talking to, and then eventually putting the phones in the wrong place and they're all over the place. Like, that to me, I found really, really fun to watch.
Yeah, and I would grant you that, especially when he winds up in that cat's cradle in the end, and apparently has a leftover phone receiver.
Right.
So yeah, and so I think I would say that your experience of the film, I mean, a very general you here, will come down to how the humor of the film works for you. If you find it funny, I think the film will be quite the rollicking experience as you go from the spectacular action scenes to the hilarious humor bits. And if that humor is working for you, then it's just the film is just going to zip along, and you're going to go back and forth, laughing and cheering as the film moves along. And it's if the humor isn't working for you, as it didn't for me, then it takes you 3 days to get through the movie.
I mean, that's fair. I mean, it's certainly the case that I think other Jackie Chan films probably will be more appealing to people more like you, because they, I think, are more cohesive and have a lot more fun with the physical comedy in a way that this film doesn't. Because not all of the pieces between the action sequences are, I mean, they're comedic, a lot of them, but they don't feel connected to the rest, right? There isn't a kind of build up. Something like Rush Hour, which I think does really effectively, is the stuff that's going on in between the action pieces is character development between these two people who come from totally different cultures. You have a Jackie Chan who speaks English, but, doesn't speak great English. And you have, Chris Tucker trying to teach him about what America's like, but there are these funny moments, this dialogue, and this great chemistry that exists between them, where it's clear they're having fun on set. Whereas in this, it's sort of, I think a lot of the other characters, like there isn't really a good secondary character here. There's not someone for Jackie Chan to really bounce off. And so a lot of those middle sequences just feel like he's talking to somebody who's just there for that particular scene, but isn't really integral to the story.
I mean, the closest is the Bridget Lynn's character
Yeah.
Selena, but and who does give some back to him. But there, I mean, again, it's whether the humor will work. And of course, Rush Hour, we're talking about a film that was made for a Western audience. And now I confess I haven't seen it since it was first released, so I basically don't remember it at all. And
It holds up.
but it also, I mean, I think one of the perhaps unfortunate things with the Rush Hour films, so this is the second time that Jackie Chan made movies in the West, and this time it worked as far in the
Right.
box office. But you have an intervening 20 years in between, and by the time of the Rush Hour films, he is no longer at his physical prime as he is in the Hong Kong films. Right. So that there are. I mean, I remember some good action moments in there. You just don't get the "oh my God, how is he still alive" reaction that you do from the most outrageous stunts in the Hong Kong films.
Yeah, and and I will just say I'm using Rush Hour as an example. It is a film meant more for a Western audience, and so it's constructed in a way that appeals, I think, to a Western audience. I would offer as a counterpoint, like something like Drunken Master, which I think does a lot more work with character development, especially with
Yes.
Jackie Chan's relationship with his father. There's tons of very dramatic scenes that really set that up as a major component for the story, and there is a resolution in that story, and so they don't feel like just things that are just there to fill the space between action sequences. And there's a lot of comedy in that too, and I think it really balances those two. So I want to give a counter example that doesn't just make me think that I'm just speaking as this from solely as Jackie Chan's only good when he's doing films for the West, which is not true. Jackie Chan is
No.
phenomenally good. I would argue you could put him in any context. Make him do a cooking show. He'd probably be hilarious somehow. He could make it work.
I do think his best films are the ones that are the Hong Kong films, where he has full creative control.
I agree that he is best, I think, when he's more in his element, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of that is the different filming standards. I mean, he just can't like legally do the kinds of things he could do
No,
in
that's
his
true.
Chinese films. But also there's different expectations of the kind of story and the expectations of what you're going to do in a film, I think, in Hong Kong cinema. Also, it's probably worth noting that, Jackie Chan, by the time he comes into Rush Hour and becomes finally established as more or less a action star in the West, outside of just strictly from films translated for the West. Jackie Chan's big period is like the late 70s through the 80s and early 90s in Hong Kong action cinema, because he virtually like establishes as a major form the sort of Hong Kong action comedy variety. He's not the only one that's doing it. There are other people, but he becomes a major star, really right at the cusp of the 80s, and Police Story is like in his prime. And it's certainly not his best film of this era. There are other films I think arguably, Rumble in the Bronx is really good, Drunken Master, some of the others that he's done. But he's like coming out of a very interesting set of traditions in terms of his upbringing. Apparently, like he went to the Peking Opera School when he was a kid, and like it was apparently awful. But he comes from this sort of theatrical upbringing with acrobatics and all of that, and he tried to sort of come in the wake of Bruce Lee after Bruce Lee's passing, who was sort of the last figure at that time who had gained prominence in the West, specifically the United States. It's hard to fill those shoes. So he ends up doing these action comedy things and establishing a genre, pulling on, his history in the Peking opera, but also, drawing on other elements from other film traditions. He draws a lot of inspiration from Western action films. He just does the Jackie Chan version of them. And it works, I think, remarkably well throughout his career, but it also establishes like this expectation of what Jackie Chan films are about that don't necessarily translate to the West in the same way. Like if you try to do a Western produced Jackie Chan film, the expectations of what films are like in the West are just going to be different than they would have been in Hong Kong action cinema. And so I agree with you that when he has more control over his own films and he's doing his own thing, when he's really on the mark, his films are just shockingly good, but they also feel different. They don't feel like what you would expect from like an 80s American action film at all. They're just the
No.
tone and everything about them is so different, and I would argue in a lot of ways superior.
Yeah.
A lot of American action films have this tendency to feel like the action is slow and lumbering, and it's just dudes punching with a horrible punch sound effect. Whereas a lot of Jackie Chan action films are acrobatic and vibrant. When he's doing the comedy, they're funny. He's using props in really unique ways. All of that feels so different from what else is going on at the same period, at least in the West. So this is my rambling way of kind of getting at that Jackie Chan comes from an interesting tradition that influences his filmmaking and also makes him, in a way, a breath of fresh air.
Well, and it certainly was the experience for so many of us in the early '90s when we started really encountering Hong Kong cinema and seeing action sequences that like we had never seen before, right? You would see the influence of that cinema on Western action film in the years that would follow, right? The Matrix being just perhaps the most obvious example, but also with people like Jackie Chan and Chow Yun-fat and John Woo and Tsui Hark coming to the States and making their mark there too. But certainly the contrast was really something, and we would sit there watching these tapes and laser discs with our jaws on the ground because we'd never seen anything like this, and that was really exciting.
And I would say another of this is that most Western exposure to kung fu films from China would have been the I think it's wuxia, WXIA, which is the wire work kind of stuff
Mm.
that's more fantastical ancient Chinese kung fu film. And Jackie Chan has done films like that, but mostly he's in a different Hong Kong action cinema. It's very different tradition than that particular, right? It's more of the sort of traditional kung fu film in the sense of more down to earth kind of kung fu versus that more fantastical, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon type stuff.
Well, that was new to the West as well, right? The Crouching Tiger being the big mainstream exposure to for I think a lot of Western audiences to that, but that was something else that was in the mix in the early '90s too. You'd be seeing films like Chinese Ghost Story, and with this amazing wire work. And I remember the first time I saw it, I didn't really understand what I was seeing, but I loved it. It was really an extraordinary thing to see. So there were these two kinds of action that neither of which was something that was familiar to the Western viewer. I mean, at this point, it's the kind of Jerry Bruckheimer production that's kind of dominating the action mode, and so this it was exhilarating to encounter this in all its different forms. I do, before I forget, have to go back to something that you said, because I suspect that our listeners, or listener, as the case may be, might be thinking this when you mentioned and you can't do a 90-minute action scene. We do have to remember that yes, you can. The Raid.
Well, but the Raid also relies on a lot more camera trickery, and I believe the Raid uses some CG for some of it as well.
I'm not sure. I mean, there's a lot. I guess my point being that you can certainly construct a movie, though, around what is essentially a 90 minutes of nonstop action.
Yeah, you're right, because you can do it. It's not common, but yeah, you're right. It is doable. I get what you mean there. Yeah, you're right.
But that's a bit of a more on the way of by way of parenthesis.
Yeah. I think we're kind of at the end of talking about this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've kind of dug into a lot of things. I will say this. Look, if you don't find the kind of middle bits to be interesting, probably the film would be a bit of a slog, and you may just skip to the action pieces that you really want to watch. The action pieces are a lot of fun. I think Police Story, to me, is a pretty solid film for in the Jackie Chan oeuvre, but I would say, is it my favorite Jackie Chan film? No. To date, Drunken Master to me is Jackie Chan's best film. Super Cop is pretty close after that. And, in his Western doing work in the West, I would say, Rush Hour is a pretty solid one. Or even doing The Foreigner was actually pretty interesting to watch. Watching a very late period Jackie Chan dealing with, the IRA and all that kind of stuff. But I do think that the Police Story is a really interesting film in his history of film production because it shows you a lot of where he's going. You know, this is 1985. This is right at like the cusp of his popularity, and he's going to go on and do some pretty astonishing films after this that really solidify the sort of Jackie Chan style of filmmaking. You know, with the amazing action sequences and stunt work, more physical comedy. We get some of that here, but you'll see way more of it. Him having way more fun doing just all kinds of interesting things with props. I just think this film is really interesting to watch from a seeing where Jackie Chan is going. Police Story gives you like that first real shove into the direction of his career.
Oh, I completely agree. And the action scenes are as spectacular now as they were then. They really are the tour de force. So I guess I'll come back to what I was saying before. Your litmus test of the viewer will be the comedy stuff in between, and if it works for you, then the film is going to be a hoot from start to finish. And if it doesn't, the opening scene and the closing scene, those are the ones you want to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's an interesting film. Gotta at least admit that.
Oh, for sure.
Well, okay, so it looks like we're basically at the end here, which means I selected Police Story. That leaves the choice now to David. So, David, what are we going to be watching next time?
Well, I went back and forth on all sorts of things, but what you said about this really being where Jackie Chan was able to fully exercise creative control, I think is going to work as a segue to my pick. So, from a film that was at the beginning, not the beginning of an artist's career, but from a point where he really is able to have control over his work. We're going to go to a film that is the opposite. So this is Mario Bava's film Lisa and the Devil, which is a film that in its uncut form is one of his late masterpieces, but that it was taken away from him almost immediately after its premiere at Cannes, I believe, and hacked up into an almost unrecognizable form called The House of Exorcism. But the original film, and that's what we're going to do, is a dreamlike, disturbingly beautiful necrophiliac tone poem where you'll never listen to the Concerto de Aranjuez the same way again. And you also get Telly Savalas as Satan.
Oh, okay. Well, that sounds disturbing, David. So thank you for whatever you're about to expose me to. I will note that there is a Blu-ray that has both versions.
Yes, that's I think the standard one that's out now.
Well, every time you give me something to watch, David, it goes one of two ways. I don't know what I just watched, but we have an interesting conversation, or I love it, and we still have an interesting conversation. So in the end,
win-win.
It all turns out good.
Yeah.
Well, perfect. So thanks, David, for suggesting this film and also being here again.
Well, thanks, Sean, for suggesting Police Story.
Absolutely. And where can folks find you if they want to find your stuffs?
They can find me at David_Annandale and on the shelves, most recently with Curse of Honor, Legend of the Five Rings book. In December, I have a Doctor Doom novel coming out called The Harrowing of Doom. And then in January, with Black Library, a Warhammer horror novel called The Deacon of Wounds.
Because David's writing more horror now.
He is.
Good man, David. And you can find me at Sean Duke on Twitter or SeanDuke.net on my website. And as for the show, you can find us at skiffyandfanty.com, where we also have a newsletter, skiffyandfanty.com/newsletter, YouTube at youtube.com/skiffyandfanty. We're on Twitter at skiffyandfanty. We also have Facebook at /skiffyandfanty. And if you want to support this show, please do. We could use all of the monies in the world. You can go to patreon.com/givemefanty, where you get access to Torture Cinema polls and other kinds of fun things. I appreciate all the support. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being here with us. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation about Police Story. And so, David, I have to say something awkward to end the show because that's how I always do it. And I will just note that this movie made me realize that sugar glass probably a good way to get cuts, so you should not use it.
Now we've all learned something useful.
Yep, this is from Sean's PSAs about, not hurting yourself. It's not really that awkward, it's just sort of a statement. be careful when you're doing your stunts. All right. Well, on that note, awkward ending and scene.
Bye.
If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/SkiffyandFanty. You can also find us on our website, skiffyandfanty.com, and on Twitter at skiffyandfanty. If you'd like to send us an email, you can do so at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. The music for this episode comes from Sphere by Creo. You can find out more about their music at freemusicarchive.org.